Jane's mom went over to the Dutch oven and removed the coals from the lid, took the Dutch oven out of the fire, and then she opened the lid, and the family looked inside, and what they saw brought tears to their eyes. If you're someone who loves real stories of courage, quiet miracles, and unwavering faith, then you're in the right place, because that's all I do, and I upload once a week. So if that's appealing to you, the next time you're at a birthday party and the like button asks, "Are you gonna eat any cake?" say yes, and then go get yourself a plate of cake and bring them back a plate of cake too. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 1856, Jane was a little 8-year-old girl. She was walking through a snowy prairie. Not only was the ground snowy, but snow was falling from the sky. She was trudging along. Her feet felt like blocks of ice, and her hands were in fists trying to stay warm. She wrapped the little shawl around her body, trying to keep in some warmth. She could still feel it though, as she walked along beside this wagon that was pulling supplies. The wheel was turning, she could hear the creaking of the wheel, and she could see her brother next to her, walking beside her. As she was walking, she suddenly felt very hungry inside, and she knew that her family didn't have much food to eat. So she started to cry, and she told her brother that she was hungry. Her brother, knowing that they didn't have much food, pulled out a knife from his pocket, opened it, and proceeded to cut, timing it just right to cut off a piece of rawhide off of the wheel of the wagon. He gave it to Jane, and she started to chew on it. Now, it didn't make her full, but it allowed her to chew so that her body could think that she was eating and not be asking her for food so much, so often. Pretty soon, Jane and her family and the company they were with stopped and proceeded to set up camp as it got nighttime, as it turned into dusk. Now, Jane and her family were pioneers traveling across the prairies to the Utah Salt Lake Valley. Their goal was to go there, to be in Zion, and this was a part of their journey, this trek across the prairies of the Midwestern United States. Jane and her family set up camp. Some of the men went off to hunt for buffalo and other food that they could find, and the rest of the people set up fires and other things. So Jane and her family got a fire created, and then they all sat around the fire and waited. They were still very hungry. They had barely anything to eat. Their rations were running low, and they still had a long ways to go on this journey. As they were sitting there, wondering what they were going to eat, Jane had an idea that they should say a prayer. So they said a prayer. They asked for Heavenly Father for a miracle. He told them that they were hungry, and then after the prayer was finished, Jane's mom suddenly sat up straighter, and she said, "Hold on a minute." She went over to the handcart, because they were also pulling handcarts at the same time. If you don't know what a handcart is, you could think of a box, a big box with two beams coming out of it and a pole going across the front. Imagine like a reverse grocery cart, except there's more space in between the compartment and the handle, so that you could stand between the compartment and the handle, and you could push the handcart. You could push this cart that's full of your supplies and your belongings. They're much cheaper to construct, and a lot of people could afford them more than they could afford a team of horses or cows and a wagon. So Jane's mom walks to this handcart, and she's rummaging around. Jane can hear the scratching and the muffled movements of stuff being moved around, and then Jane's mom finally lifts up out of the handcart a little tin box. She takes it over to the fire, and The kids know what it is. They've seen it before. But she opens the lid, and inside she smiles because there are 2 very hard biscuits. She takes one out, looks at it, and then proceeds to try and take a bite. Unfortunately, these biscuits, not only were they frozen, but they were very, very old. Now, how old were they? Well, we have to go back a few months to really figure that out. You see, Jane and her family didn't just start traveling, going across the prairie. No, they'd been traveling for months. And a long time had passed. And these biscuits in this tin can were actually from the very start of their journey. Jane and her family came from England. And in England, they bought some rations, and the biscuits were part of the rations that they bought to make the journey across the ocean. Now, Jane and her family wanted to come to the Americas to join the saints in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that were going to Utah. So they first heard about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from missionaries. And a missionary in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a man or a woman that will usually leave their home for 18 months to 2 years, and they will voluntarily spend their money and their time to teach people about Jesus Christ and the restored gospel in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So Jane and her family heard about the gospel from missionaries in England, and then they were baptized and decided to make the journey, as the First Presidency was encouraging many people at the time to travel to Zion and to Salt Lake City, which is where they had headquartered the church. So Jane and her family decided to board a ship and go across the ocean. A trip of which would take 3 months by itself, especially if they were on a sailing boat. Back in that time, there were usually 2 types of ships that people would travel across the ocean with. One was a steamboat, which usually costed $30 to $40 per person to take them across the ocean, but it would only take maybe 10-15 days. The other one was a sailing ship. Sailing ships were much cheaper, about $10 to $15 per person. However, they would take much longer, around 3 months' time. The First Presidency of the church at the time was encouraging members of the church to travel together in groups and to use sailing ships because the cost would be much lower and cheaper. And they were funding a lot of this with the Perpetual Immigration Fund, which was a fund set up to help people immigrate to Salt Lake City, members of the church. And the money in there was provided by other saints who were able to donate their resources. So Jane and her family were recipients of some of that money from the Perpetual Immigration Fund, and they boarded a sailing ship. They traveled 3 months across the ocean with those biscuits as part of their rations. Once they landed in the Americas, probably near Boston, they then traveled. A lot of saints, after they landed in the Americas, would then travel by train as far as they could get. Now, remember, at this time, the Transcontinental Pacific Railroad was not built yet. That wouldn't come till later in the 1800s. But there was some railroads, so they would travel by railroad as far as they could get, and then they would travel the rest of the way either on foot to a staging area or by riverboat. Now, a staging area is a place that was set up for the saints to gather all their supplies that they would need to make the final trek from the frontier to Salt Lake City. The frontier where there was no more civilization except in sparse communities. So Jane and her family went from Boston area, train, riverboat, and then ended up in Iowa City, one of the staging areas. And from there, they gathered their handcarts, their supplies, got into companies, groups of members who would travel together to provide support and help. And then they started their 1,300-mile journey all the way to the Salt Lake Valley. And now, they were in the middle of the winter, no food, and they were hungry. And the only thing that they had to eat was 2 rock-hard biscuits. So, Jane's mom tried taking a bite. She couldn't get any food off. She just wanted a morsel to kind of ease her hunger, but nothing came off the biscuit. They passed the biscuit around. People tried breaking it, biting it again. Nothing worked. After sitting for a while, Jane's mom had an idea that after they sat and prayed some more, she had an idea that maybe we could put these biscuits in the Dutch oven. So she went over to the Dutch oven and placed the 2 biscuits inside and put the lid on, and then she went to the fire, created a pile of coals to place the Dutch oven on top. After she had set the Dutch oven on top, she carefully placed coals on top of the Dutch oven. If you don't know what a Dutch oven is, it's a cast iron bowl and it has a lid on it, and you can use it to cook over fire. You have to put coals on the bottom and the top though to make it like a actual oven so that there's heat all around the item or food being cooked. So Jane's mom, after making sure that the coals were perfectly placed how she wanted them, she sat back and the family waited and prayed some more. And during this period of waiting, Jane couldn't help but think about the story of Jesus Christ when he fed the multitude of 5,000 people with a few loaves of bread and some fishes. The multitude had been following Jesus all day, and it was approaching nighttime, and they were very hungry, and they were telling the disciples, the 12 disciples, that they need to eat. Is there any food? So the disciples approached Jesus and they told him everyone's hungry and they should go to the village and eat, or to the town that they were nearby and eat. Jesus looked on the multitude, and as he does, he had compassion on them. So he asked the disciples, "What food do we have here?" And they said, "We have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes." They brought the food to Jesus. And then Jesus prayed over the food, and he broke the bread and portioned it out and gave it and filled 12 baskets full of food from those 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Then those 12 disciples ate themselves, and then they went and passed the food out to the multitude. Now, you have to remember that this multitude, in the Bible, it says it's 5,000 men. That doesn't account for if every man had a spouse, that'd be an extra 5,000, and then if they all had one other kid, that'd be an extra 5,000. There was probably more than that amount of people there. And so the disciples go and pass all of that food out, and then they bring the baskets back to Jesus, and left over is 12 baskets full of food. So Jane was thinking of this story that she'd heard many times in the Bible as she was sitting there waiting for these biscuits to cook and wondering what's going to happen. And she thought, surely if Jesus could help feed that many people, he could help feed my little family. And that's what she thought about at this time. Soon, Jane's mom went over to the Dutch oven and removed the coals from the lid, took the Dutch oven out of the fire, and then she opened the lid, and the family looked inside, and what they saw brought tears to their eyes. They all gasped. Those 2 biscuits were not 2 biscuits anymore, but the whole Dutch oven was full to the brim with food, enough for not only their family to eat, but for other families to eat as well. From then on, Jane knew that Heavenly Father was aware of her and her family, and they were able to continue their trek to Zion, to Salt Lake City, with hope. That's the story, guys. And maybe if you're like me, it reminded you that God is still in the details of our life. And if you got something out of it, please subscribe and share it with someone who might need some upliftment. And remember that the next time you're at a birthday party and the like button asks you if you're going to eat a piece of cake, say yes, and then go and get yourself a plate of cake and bring them back a plate of cake as well. We'll see you next time. Thank you.